Hello again, listeners to Radio Northern Beaches, Community Voices. I'm Michael Lester. It's now over 5 years now, May 2017, since the 240 delegates for the First Nations Constitutional Convention released the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and an invitation to the community and to the government. And it proposed some new arrangements for a voice for Indigenous people, a Makaratta or truth-telling process, and a treaty. Now, in the government budget only a few weeks ago, some $160 million was set aside for preparation for the Indigenous recognition referendum, specifically about the voice proposition coming up in 2023. Our guest today, Geoff Scott, is going to be speaking about this to our local community on Northern Beaches on Monday, the 14th November, at 7:30 at Mona Vale. Geoff Scott has over 35 years' experience directly in Aboriginal and Indigenous affairs. He's a Wiradjuri man from the Narromine area of New South Wales. The number of senior posts that he's held in Indigenous affairs is a very intimidating list, including Deputy Co-Chair of ATSIC, CEO, Executive Officer of the Referendum Council, a key leader in the Uluru Dialogue, CEO of the National Congress of Australia's First People, and, of course, importantly in New South Wales, was the Director General of the New South Wales Department of Aboriginal Affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm pleased to be with you. Speaking from Gadigal land, and pay my respect to elders past, present and future.
Indeed we do. Thanks for that. Welcome to country. So this voice proposition, we're going to all be voting in a referendum next year, as I said. What is essentially the concept and the idea behind the voice, and particularly as a constitutionally enshrined institution?
The call for a voice, and then from Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, is not something new. It's been happening since the 1930s and even earlier than that. And it's found its way in various different machinations of organisations over the years. There was a process, it was started by John Howard in the 90s to try and look at recognition of Aboriginal people in the Constitution. Now, some of it there was about having mentioned in the preamble, but in 2015 to 17, we held a series of dialogues around the country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, asking their views on the various suggestions that have been put forward to amend the Constitution. One, to acknowledge Aboriginal people in the Constitution, and to put in measures which would actually assist in resolving the current issues. And at the end of it, out of those dialogues, we met at Uluru, and they come up with the issue of what we need is our voice back. All the other measures won't change things. We need a voice so we can be heard. And we haven't been heard now since ATSIC was abolished in 2004. What it is, and the reason for being in the Constitution and being protected is that all those other voices in the past years have been abolished when government wished to do it, when it didn't suit them. And we don't want to keep going down that track of having a voice, then not having a voice.
So there were various forms of the voice, and particularly, as I mentioned, you were involved very closely, obviously, with one of them at ATSIC, which was abolished,
yes.
Which any government can do if it's not in the Constitution readily. The current proposals are for constitutional enshrinement so that it can't be changed by fiat of government without reference not even to the Parliament, back to the people.
That's right. It must go back to people. And if people who have seen the statement would show that the statement was issued to the people of Australia, not to the Parliament, and not to the politicians. Referendum and recognition is between people. We all live in this country. So it was commencing that conversation directly with the people of Australia.
What do we know about the particular form that a voice might take? What do we know about the nature of the referendum proposal as such? And will that be telling us what this voice, how it's going to be structured and what it's going to do?
I'd suggest to you not in precise detail that many people are asking about. I mean, the reason we're having this proposal is that having a voice is the right thing to do. It's the thing we should be doing. It's the right thing to do and at the right time. I think it's because of right and the best practice, but Parliament is the one who has the power over the makeup of the powers and because it's how our Constitution works. If a referendum gets into place, it suggests that the Australian people agree that Aboriginal people should have a voice protected in their Constitution. It's then up to Parliament to consult with people about what form that voice would take, what form, how it would be organised, what would its powers be, what was their ambit and its remit be. And that gives the possibility for the Parliament, who are the people who are elected, to actually change that after speaking with people and change that voice and evolve it over time. If you decide before the Constitution's up, who would decide it? The media? There's no process for that. And then that'll be in place. So it needs to change over time. It would. The previous government decided to walk away from the voice and decide up a advisory committee to the government. Points that they didn't go through. What the report's useful from one extent, where it's mapped what was on the ground now. It's out there now on the ground is what was mapped. That's useful for identifying what's there at the moment, and there's various people who have various views about that.
Right.
and a report came out recommending it, then the government was going to go ahead and implement it. But what was on the ground wasn't working. So I don't know how you get progress when you document what's on the ground that's not working, and then you put what's not working into legislation.
Yeah, there are many precedents in the Constitution where there are broad statements, and over time, as you say, parliaments have had to give form and effect, either through conventions and how things work, and or presumably by legislation. Is that the sort of process that is envisaged for the constitutional referendum to put in place? Is it?
Yes, you've got it exactly right. It's the Parliament's role to do that. That's how our Constitution works. We're not here to change how the Constitution works or how our democracy works. We want to have a permanent place in that democracy. And that's the right way. They'll go and hold their joint house committees or whatever process they put in place post the referendum when it's successful. It'll be positive. And they'll decide the form and the structure because things are evolving over time. And because there's been no leadership at the national level now for 10 or 15 years, states have gone out and started developing their own models, which are around the place. So you've got to have a process which takes into account what's evolving, what's emerging. Otherwise, you ride over what's there, and that's a perfect way not to have them because you're actually challenging what's on the ground, and many people are working hard at getting that to work and work properly. So it's a way of actually taking into account and make sure it works because the state governments provide a lot of services and issues for Aboriginal people around the country, and they've got to be involved in this as well. So working out how that would work together is very important. So it's been 25 years of Close the Gap, and we're not closing it. We spend $30 billion a year in Aboriginal affairs, and we're not having effect. I think it's time for a change here. Any right-thinking, clear-minded Australian would suggest that if we're spending that amount of money and we're not having an impact, there's something wrong. And what the voice is about is going back to the very people that's supposed to be assisted by this and saying, well, what's working, what's not. And that hasn't been happening now for 20 years. And there have been successes here and there, but they're not sustainable. To some extent, we've got to change the relationship between community and government. And that's not just between Aboriginal people and the government, it's between the Australians and government. There's got to be a better way of working through those issues. And people talk about what the other programs are. Those programs will continue. And the very people who are criticising, who are saying this, they think we can't do more than one thing at once, which I find strange. And the other thing is they were the party in power for the last decade. What did they do? This is about having some real change and getting people some real confidence in the fact that they'll be involved in it. We'll focus on having, hopefully, with Steve looking back this in a decade, there won't be those problems. We hope.
There's a lot of debate about the form that this organisation might take and criticism that it will constitute a third chamber of parliament and have veto powers over any legislation. What's behind those sorts of criticisms?
I think it's called scaremongering. I'll be blunt with you. I mean, these are the same things we have when the Native Title Act was in place. The same people were saying then that your backyards are under threat. That's going to be taken away. Never happened. Of course. And the same thing's here. This is not a third chamber. It's a voice to Parliament, not in Parliament. It's a very issue here. And the very fact people talk about it, there's debates about what it can and can't say. Well, and lawyers will get involved. But if the law is that you just listen, and you should listen, you don't have to agree, but just listen. That's all we're asking for here. And that seems to scare people.
About the range of issues over which and in respect of which any voice that might be put in place might have some sort of role or contribution to make.
Yeah, well, there'll be a whole range of issues. Most programs affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to a lesser or greater extent. I think the scope is there for that. People have been trying to work through how you actually define that scope and have a debate around it. Well, that's a perfect way to have a lawyer's picnic. Now, the things are here that the voice is out there. The voice has actually got to make its case. It's got to present its arguments for its policies and its efforts for change or tweaking what's happening and what the priorities are, what's important. But it's not just going to say it. We've got to back it up with hard evidence and strong policy issues on a basis that it will have effect. I mean, I hear people speak about this, but I think they're looking for an argument. An issue here is that if you have something there where it compels the government to listen, how hard is that? That should be happening now. And it's an indictment. It doesn't happen now. But this is what the voice is about, saying, well, here it is. Let's make it really part of it. And people will be able to talk about these things.
What is the level of, as we look to a referendum, what is the level, do you think, or do we know, of broad public awareness of the Uluru Statement, in particular of the voice and its proposition, and the level of support or otherwise in the community?
Our polling has been consistently high over the last 4 or 5 years since the Uluru Statement was put in place. That's remained in the mid-70s, which is quite good. But we always know that when the referendum actually comes in, we'll be expected to provide much more information around where it's at and then be able to answer the questions that many people may have. But we think the majority of Australians are decent, fair-minded people who will support this proposal. It's not a challenge to our government or our democracy. It actually enhances our democracy. It includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution for the first time, in a positive sense.
The politics of all this in the current Parliament with its makeup in terms of support for this. If there's to be a referendum, is that a decision that can just be taken by executive government to put a referendum in place, or
you've got to put a bill through Parliament, a referendum bill, and has to be passed by both houses of Parliament. And on the day that both houses of Parliament pass that legislation, then the government has a window between 2 months, not less than 2 months, not more than 6 months, to hold a referendum.
Right.
That's why the government will work out when they want to put that into Parliament, because as soon as it goes through, the clock starts ticking. So it's got to line up with their planning, what the phases are, when it should be. And that's all being worked through by the people there now. And at Parliament, there's a lot of lobbying going on and briefing politicians, because they've got many questions. Because up until the current Prime Minister announced on his victory speech at the election, and when he opened Parliament, and at Garma, he's actually went out and said, we shall hold a referendum. It shall be on implementing the Uluru Statement in full. Now, when people hear that, they say, well, it's going to happen. It's serious. We now need to get our head around what's going on with it. And all the information that's been there has been out and available for 4 or 5 years.
And how do you see the party politics at the moment with a view to the referendum, even before referendum can happen, needing to pass that okay through the Parliament? How do you read the politics at the moment? I think the numbers are there to even get the referendum bill through?
We're very confident the numbers are there. In the lower house, Labor has a majority. In the upper house, the Greens already said they won't oppose the bill itself. And we have many of the independents as well who will be supporting it.
Although the Greens have said they've got a different set of priorities for the Uluru Statement.
The Greens want us to actually focus on doing truth-telling and treaty at the same time. And that's quite possible. People are doing it as we speak. The sequence from Uluru was that we have voice first, which then provides the vehicle to advance any treaty and agreement-making processes or truth-telling. And that was a very deliberate process. They had some structure and some rigour and discipline about the process. It's doing their own at the moment, which is, without Commonwealth leadership, has been happening now for the last 5 or 6 years.
The budget did allocate $160 million to prepare for this referendum. How is this money going to be spent? What sort of processes and activities need to be undertaken that require that much money to put this referendum in place?
Well, the majority of that money will go to the Electoral Commission, and that's been in the budget for 4 or 5 years, actually.
Right.
It was put in place by the previous government. That was a contingency fund for the referendum. They can't actually say it wasn't, because they put it there. It's largely for processes. If you hold an election, and you hold a referendum which is out of the election cycle, which we think that's how it'll happen, you've still got to set up a polling booth, the number of polling booths in every electorate. You've got to staff the polling booth, you've got to get all the information out, have all the roles in place, all the same thing as you do for an election. So all of those mechanics, if you like, and the housekeeping around making sure the elections, the vote's done properly. And
will there be any money and activities set aside for public education campaigns and yes and no campaigns, or not out of that money?
As we understand, I think the government's going to do a bit of civics education, if we understand it. I mean, we are of the view that they've got to put a Referendum Machinery Act through, which is changing how the referendums are run, what the rules around it. And there was an inquiry in the last government about that, and the recommendations are there. We understand the government's working on that now. We'll introduce a bill fairly soon. But we do understand that they won't be funding a yes or a no campaign.
They won't?
No. That's our understanding.
Why is there a need to change the machinery of the referendum itself through a separate bill?
There's various links between how the wording's done, linking back to the bill itself, looking back to the amendments in the Constitution. There's various machinery about that, how information is then distributed to voters. And it's really about modernising the referendum machinery, the process around a referendum.
Right.
The last one we had was in 1999, was just 22 years ago. And the last successful one was 1977.
Speaking with Geoff Scott here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, I'm Michael Lester, and Geoff is going to be appearing on Monday, the 14th of November at 7:30 at the Mona Vale Centre to speak about the voice and particularly the coming constitutional referendum that we're having. And thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule, Geoff, for letting our listeners know a little bit more about what's involved and how they can find out more. Thanks, Geoff, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Michael, and to your listeners. Thank you.